Today's video is a long one, but we're going to go through the perfect assembly of all the major components of your bicycles. That's bottom bracket, headset, wheels and brakes to make sure that you get a perfectly quiet bike, a smooth ride, none of your components wear out prematurely. So let's get started because all of this depends on a precision fit. Right, we're going to start off with this raw frame. Now, we have already spent a few hours on this doing a full ride wrap. Now, a bit like InvisiFrame, you haven't come across it. Ride wrap is another brand name. So all of this is like layers of a clear film that's put across the whole thing. It's a pretty time consuming process, probably worth doing if you want to keep your paintwork in pristine condition. But while I've been able to do that, I've had a really good look at all the paintwork. And now I'm going to start looking on the inside. Now, the very first thing I want to do is get this out of my hand into a work stand. I need to put a seat post in. And before I do that, I want to make sure that in here, there are no nicks or burrs or anything. So I want to make sure that no paint has come onto the inside that's going to restrict movement of the seat post or cause a high point. Any sort of high point or burr or dirt in there can put some stress on that carbon. So this feels good. There's a tiny little burr just down there, but that's away from the clamping area. Here's an example of a seat post issue that we've just fixed recently. Now, this resulted from the inside of the seat post being really poorly finished, and the customer has been riding for a long time complaining that the seat post is constantly slipping, gave up, came into us. This is the old seat post we've removed, and you run your finger along this and there's evidence of all sorts of scoring and marks. It's a real mess in here, really. And on the inside was just the same. Now, no amount of carbon construction paste or anything was helping this situation. So what we've done is remove all this, cleaned it all out, gone in there and remove all of the burrs, and now we've got a really good clean surface. And now we've had to manufacture a 0.1 millimeter shim to then fit an aluminium seat post and get this to work again. And now we have a working seat post again, but all of this could have been solved if they actually checked the inside of this at the factory to make sure this wasn't going to happen to start with. The seat post should slide in without any sort of problem at all, so that should be pretty free to go. Now, we are going to clamp this right up here because any sort of scratches that might occur from this, we're going to be dead careful, of course we are all going to appear here and hopefully won't be seen when the actual bike's assembled. And if anything requires effort, you shouldn't need to push past anything. If anything, you can feel a burr, get back in there and sort it out. Don't just sort of persevere with it. Now, you can see what I'm doing is I'm clamping right down as close to the frame as I can, and this is just being nipped up, super gentle, just enough to hold the frame. Okay, first thing I want to look at is the headset here. So the first thing we'll do is one, make sure these bearings are actually going to fit. And again, what I'm looking for is any sort of burrs or high spots. You'll be able to run your finger around here and feel perfectly smooth. This bearing should be what they call a slip fit. So unlike a bottom bracket PressFit where you need some tooling or some pressure to install it, this shouldn't take any effort, but at the same time, it shouldn't just wobble around loose. So this is what we call a slip fit, and it should sit clean and flush. If I put pressure on this, I should be able to rock it. So if there's a high spot, even as much as a grain of sand, there'll be a high spot. This is a terrible example. You see all this paint in here. Now, it may look fairly inconsequential to you, but when you put a bearing on here and rock it, you can feel it rock on this minute, uneven surface. Now, we're going to go in here and sort this out, but this is important because now that cables run internally, you really want to make sure these bearings are sat neat and tidy and prolong their life, because as you can see, to get to this, we had to take off all the cables through that internally routed handlebar and frame, and then we're going to have to rerun it again, probably put new cables in and then bleed them up again. So this job really needs to be done, if anything, just to prolong your headset bearings and save yourself a job. Anyway, this is how we're going to fix it. We are going to use, I'm going to have to bring this down to a level so that we can work like this, which means you guys don't get to see, but the tool does get to sit completely straight. That's the great thing about these stands, is that you can set up everything perfectly. And we're only cutting carbon, so we want to go really light with this, but if you can take a look around this edge, you'll see around here how that tool is not sitting flat. Now we're talking. That is how that should be. A solid fit now. So much better. So while we're still on the headset end, we're going to take a look at the fork. So on a lot of carbon road bikes now, you notice there's not a flat interface here where you have to fit a separate crown race. The crown race is now just built into the taper of the fork. And this is the surface here that you want absolutely perfectly smooth. What you'll sometimes see is where there's a seam, where they've joined this together, that seam will run and you'll find like a tiny little bit of tenting just at the bottom here. This should be absolutely perfectly smooth. If it isn't, get in there with a piece of sandpaper and smooth it down. Here's another great example. In this case, the frame is actually a really, really good fit, but the problem is actually here on the fork. And what's caused it to happen is that this bearing is worn away until it's just come apart. Now, customers have been complaining for quite a long time that they can feel like a clicking motion on their headset, and when we've now finally got the fork out, remember it's quite a big job to remove the fork, we can feel a ridge. You can see where the seam of carbon is here. If you run your fingernail across here, you can feel that ridge. So when you fit a bearing, you can rock it. What we want to do now is go back in just with a bit of a light sandpaper and just sand off that ridge so that we get a perfectly flush bearing fit on there. This should be a really solid fit. It should not be able to move like that. Just like here, you should be able to put your bearing over the top and that should sit square. And when you've added some pressure, you shouldn't be able to rock it. If there was like a high spot, you'd feel it rock. Again, persevere with it and make sure there's no high spots. And also where you're going to be clamping the stem, this needs to be perfectly smooth as well. So just run your fingers around and make sure that's all perfectly smooth. Again, if you're going to clamp anything here, you definitely don't want any high spots. So the same goes for the inside, where you're going to be fitting a compression bung like this. And again, this is going to expand outwards to provide some resistance. One, so that we can preload the bearings, but also so that when we clamp this with a stem, it's got something to actually resist against. We're not just going to be crushing the carbon. So again, if you've got anything rough in here, that's going to provide a high spot. So this should be smooth. Also worth checking is the uniformity of the wall thickness. Quite a lot of road bikes will come with a very thin section and a big thick section here, which means that when you put something like this in, it won't fit square. It will just be off to one side slightly, and that will cause your headset to creak if that is offset, because you'll never get all your bearings aligned squarely. So this is all looking perfect. Next up, we're going to go for a dry fit to make sure all this comes together well. So we're going to go bearing onto here. Always worth doing this as a dry fit before you start running any sort of cables. Got your compression bung, and again, compression bungs these days are often made of plastic. Depending on where the plastic moulding has been made, you can sometimes get little plastic flashings just where you don't want it. Where it interacts with either the inside where it's going to be hitting the carbon or where it's going to be touching the bearing, again, should be perfectly smooth. On these particular bikes, you have a big gap, but quite often this tolerance is really, really fine. You need to make sure that when you apply pressure here, that this top cap is not fouling the paintwork. If it is, you're going to need to build this up with some shims or get in there with a facing tool and remove some of the paint. But this one has particularly been designed because it's got paint on the top here, so that it's nice and free rotating. All right, next up is the bottom bracket. Now, I'm not going to labour the point on this bike because we covered this loads on the channel, but this has a BSA bottom bracket, so it's threaded. Now, in this particular bike, rather than having a big aluminium tube that goes the whole way through, they've actually bonded the threads in independently, left and right. We really, really want to make sure that these threads are absolutely clean to sort of prevent any problems down the way. What we're doing here, again, just dry fit, no grease, no nothing. This is just a dry fit of the bearing. So we're going to go right hand side, and this should all thread in finger tight all the way up to the face. And when it does, you should now be able to look and see if you can see daylight anywhere. So we're looking for a completely flush fit. Now, if you're unsure, you can use some feeler gauges to check. I can see a gap just here, and this is my 0.1 feeler gauge, and you can see that disappears in here. This one gets tight here, like I can't do that up anymore with hand pressure now, and that's as far as that goes. So we've got a problem with the threads on this side. Now, don't just persevere with this and like just keep tightening it, because like I say, these are bonded in and you really don't want to cross thread it. Remember, nowadays, because we're now bonding in threads into carbon, this is literally just glued in. We really don't want to risk anything in the future, so we can tidy that up. So we've got two problems on this side. We don't actually know what the facing is like because we can't get this in all the way, and this one we have a little problem just here. The last time I did one of these on camera, a couple of armchair mechanics got really, really upset with me, so I'm going to fix this off camera and show you the end result. In fact, one sneaky little peek. One of the tools that I might use to fix this is a facing tool. This isn't a reamer, this is for facing. Reaming is a completely different job altogether. But one of the problems we have is that this facing tool is only 44 millimeters. And this bottom bracket, the bits, this face here, that we need to interface cleanly with this is a little bit bigger at 46 millimeters. So This isn't going to fix it, sadly, because the problem with this is actually where this frame has been faced in the factory. So you can imagine they've put a piece of masking tape over this and then painted the entire frame. And according to the instructions, it has been faced at the factory. They've only faced this 41 millimeters. So let's see if I can explain this a little bit better for you. Here's a diagram. This little squiggly bit here is the threads of your BSA bottom bracket. So this is a BSA bottom bracket just bonded into your carbon frame. This flat bit I've drawn with a ruler represents the facings that we've done with a facing tool. And this is normally 44 millimeters. And after that, we get blobs of paint and frame and everything else and all that detritus. Now, the problem that we're facing is that a standard BSA bottom bracket should be between 43 and 44 millimeters on this circumference. So if we face it, we know that this flat surface is going to interact with this flat surface. However, what we're finding is with these new bonded in super lightweight threads, that they're only facing this to 41 millimeters. Now that is a problem because the only bottom brackets that will really fit with that is this, the Ultegra, which measures 40.5 millimeters, or a Dura Ace, which measures 39 millimeters. So all of the SRAM, Dub, etc., Ceramic Speed, Hope, which are all made to 43 to 44, will overlap, and the edges are going to be rocking on the paintwork rather than having a really good flat interface. So even though the instructions say, hey, we face this from factory, there's no need to face it, that only applies if you know that you're going to run either a Dura Ace or an Ultegra bottom bracket. What a mess. Hope that helps. Specialised to face this, you can see the carbon here, and then there is a lip of paint. Can you hear? Here's the problem. Specialised have only faced this to 40.1 millimeters, but a SRAM Dub bottom bracket across here measures 43 millimeters. So what that means is that this face is going to be touching paint rather than this nice flat piece of carbon. This is going to act a bit like a bearing puller, pulling these threads towards the bottom bracket, and also this bottom bracket is going to rock on this uneven paint finish rather than the nice flat carbon finish here.
Right. Stick it in there.
Next up is the brake mounts. Now we've already put a video out explaining how we face the brake mounts on this, so I won't labour the point. If you want to, I'll link you back to that video down in the description. But brake mounts are super, super important. If these brake mounts are even remotely out, you're always going to end up with either your brakes rubbing or you'll never get that bite point, because you remember you want those two parts of the brake pads touching the brake rotor absolutely simultaneously for the absolute best bite point and best performance. If they're even ever so slightly out, then you're looking for slack in the pistons to be taken up, and you're never going to get the absolutely sharp bite point that you're after. So the next bit we're really interested in is the interface between the wheel axles and the frame here as well. So what I want you to do is make sure that where the axle is going to touch, that this is completely flat and smooth. Quite often you'll find a paint overrun on this edge, and if there is, you won't find that the hub can sit in those dropouts cleanly. So make sure there's no paint or burrs or anything along these edges and the edge where the actual hub touches. Now the same on the drive side, because you want your mech hanger as well to have a completely clean interface, because if there's any paint or dirt or burrs on here, this is just not going to fit flush. So nice and clean. You should be able to offer this up and just rock it in your hands. And if you feel anything rock or you've got to force it into position, like something's wrong. Take your rear axle and it should be able to thread through all the way as easily as that. The thread should start that easily, and thread it in all the way by hand. That's it. It should be as simple as that. That is perfect. If you've got to manipulate it around, or you can't quite get the thread started, or you've got to use a tool to do that, it's wrong. You're probably going to have to make sure that your mech hanger is lined up with the hole, that these two holes are aligned up, and you might need to go back and tap this thread here, which is why I'm not a massive fan of the new Pinarello, because the new Pinarello puts a piece of carbon over this, which means that you then can't run a frame tap through there as well. This is perfect. It means that anything goes wrong in there, it gets dirty, it gets corroded, you accidentally cross thread it or put the wrong axle in it, we can get in there and fix it. New Pinarellos, no chance. Last bit of the inspection, we go back to the fork and we just check these brake mounts. Again, in that disc brake mounting video, I showed you how you check the front fork as well. So if you're interested, go and check that video out. But the front axle is exactly the same. Again, you should be able to thread this in and out dead easily by hand, and there should be no paint or burrs on these surfaces where your wheels are going to sit. With all that checked, we're happy that this frame is now in good condition. Let's get building. First job to do is to put the rear caliper on and run that hose. Now, before we do that, we need to make sure we get the right mounting hardware. Now, this distance here is different on quite a lot of frames. They are becoming more and more standard, but when you buy your group set, you'll find that it comes with a standard set of bolts, which might not always be the correct size. So SRAM, Shimano, Campagnolo, they all sell the right size bolts. So you need to measure this, tell the brand, you know, put it into the website what distance that is, and it'll tell you which bolt you're going to need. So when you put the bolt through with the required number of spacers, so on SRAM like this, you just have a washer. With Shimano, you might have to put a little spacer as well. You should have this 6 to 7 millimeters of threads. For SRAM, it should be a flush fit. For Shimano, they'll have that little cap head, which means that you can put that little circlip in place to lock it off as well. So bolt length here is critically important. The next thing I like to do is to fit one of these little Jaguar mini top tubes. And this is going to sit just here on the frame because I don't want any of this cabling to rattle at all. You can see what I'm doing here is just trying to make sure that this caliper and uncurl all the cables as we go. It's silly things like this, like not holding on to this, that will scratch your frame. So just trying to keep hold of all the ends and gradually untwist all these. There we go, look at that, working with perfectly faced brake mounts, absolute dream. There's no gaps around any of that at all, beautiful. Now with SRAM, this bolt shouldn't penetrate the outside of this. You should just see like one thread probably left. With Shimano, you should only see that tiny little mushroom on the top, so you can put a circlip on it. So that's absolutely perfect. This little top tube here is just going to sit flush against here, and that's just going to prevent any sort of vibration of this against the frame. So a bit of vibration damping. Talking of which, the next bit we need to do is this sound. Nobody likes that, so we're going to deaden that down next. This has got brake coding to keep it well away from your eyes. And we push that as far down as we possibly can. So with SRAM levers, remember that there's a little one-way valve inside the levers, but not in the cable. So you can unscrew this, just keep everything upright and you shouldn't get any spillage. And take the brake pads out. The reason I'm not doing this first is because when they're fully bled like this from the factory, that little bit of red plastic is jammed in there. Okay, and this time we need to take this adapter off. Now you might need to change this for 140 or 160 rotors, or quite a lot of bikes these days now have their own proprietary adapters. Setting up the fork, this is how we want it. I like to use electrical tape to bind this down. You can use a piece of heat shrink if you want to. I have used that in the past. I've come back to using electrical tape because I think you can actually cover this hole a bit better and really make sure you bind this down. When you do this, make sure there's no crinkles, take your time, cut the edges flush. What you don't want is any sort of rough surface, because this is going to be rubbing potentially on this cable if you don't set it up properly. So keep this nice and smooth and flush. So what I've done here, I've already set the bearing up on the bottom here with grease on both surfaces, and I've put the top bearing in as well with grease, and that means I can feed this through. So now I know that I've got the rear brake here. It's coming to my left hand side. Just the tiniest smear of grease on this surface. You really don't want to be using loads and loads of grease. Loads and loads of grease will just collect loads and loads of dirt. And then we've got our compression. So the important thing here is to get everything all lined up, ready to go on your workbench so you don't drop anything. So when we're building a bike like this, you will come to your bike fitting with every single spacer we can get our hands on, because we want to make sure you can sit on a turbo trainer and absolutely will nail that fit before we cut anything at all. So I'm going to fit all of these spacers for now. Cool, there we go. Persevere with this, make sure everything is lined up, because this is the cockpit you're going to spend most of your time staring at. So if something is out of line or not quite perfect, you will notice it because you're going to spend hours looking at it. Bottom bracket installation, so we've got aluminium against aluminium, so you want to make sure you use a grease that is designed for assembly, something that's going to prevent corrosion. I personally like something like a calcium sulfonate grease, but something just relatively inert. You can use PTFE as a bit of a trend. You might have seen us make a video on that in the past. It didn't go so well on T47 where the threads are a bit skinnier. Might work okay on BSA, but personally, if you use a really good quality grease, I just can't see the need to do that at all. So one grease I would avoid though is that horrible white, like lithium. Oh, it's disgusting. Just try and stay away from that. The important thing when you do this, don't crank on it and put pressure on here. Support the frame and make sure that you're cranking on the frame and not cranking on the seat post, and wipe off any excess grease. If you're installing a SRAM crankset, you need to pay careful attention to the spacers that you need to use. So the instructions for this say 1mm on the non-drive side and a 3mm spacer on the drive side. And you see it comes with a whole bunch of spacers like this. One of the things I can recommend if you are fitting SRAM is that this preload adjuster here is pretty poor actually, and it breaks quite easily. So we are going to remove that. And what you'll see is this is actually in two pieces. So there's actually a threaded piece and this piece here. So what can happen is these threads all get cross-threaded and chewed up, and this little bolt here is really easy to break as well. It's a really, really common thing. So we're going to swap this out with a proper aluminium one. What we're looking for here, assuming that we've got a really good alignment, is that this should push through without any sort of major restriction, which it does perfectly. If you happen to tap this or force it with a hammer or anything like that, something is definitely wrong. Go back, check your alignment again. So either check those threads or check the facings because those bearings aren't aligned. It should be as easy as that. So once we've got that in, we need to come back and revisit our preload. And what we want to make sure is that I can't push. You see right now that slips. So we're going to use that adjuster, push it all the way this way, and then use this preload just to take up that slack until we've got no lateral play, but we still have free rotation. Once you're happy, then you can tighten down that bolt. One final check, if you want to make sure that the chain line is right to the specs. We've talked about this before, but to take a line from the center of the bottle cage mount to the middle point between these two chain rings should give us 46mm, which it does. So that just confirms that we've got all of those marks right. So from here on in, it's really just a case of front mech, rear mech, install the wheels and follow that process of setting up all your gears, and that is for a different video. But this is all about frame preparation, making sure that all your key mounting points are clean, flush, installed correctly. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and you've learned a few bits and pieces from it. As always, get your feedback and your comments down in the boxes below. And if you like this sort of content, please think about subscribing. We're going to continue on with this perfect installation series for a little bit longer, in which case I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.